Before we turn things over to our colleague Jeff Greenfield, a quick review of where we are in this tragedy at about the top of the hour. Here are the latest developments. The manhunt continues tonight. 2 new arrest warrants were issued as the FBI continues to round up people described only as material witnesses. These warrants remain sealed, so no details are available to us. Finally, police were back in Delray Beach, Florida today, searching the apartment of one of the known terrorists. The investigation. And in other parts of the story, after huddling with his top military advisors, President Bush returned to the White House today and issued a warning that Tuesday's attacks have, quote, roused a military giant. And finally, the rescue operation continues behind us here in New York City. The numbers are hard to say. 4,957 missing, 190 confirmed dead. In a little less than 11 hours now, Wall Street goes back to work after 4 days of being shut down by the blast. There's an enormous amount of anxiety about what will happen when the opening bell rings, what investors will do, what computers and all the technology will do. They say all things are go. That's the subject of Jeff Greenfield's conversations coming up in a moment. We'll see you again at noon tomorrow. Until then, good night.
Aaron, thank you. The financial world is keeping a very watchful eye on the Asian markets that have already opened tonight. They'll be keeping a watchful eye on the American markets that reopen on Monday. But the aftershocks from Tuesday's attacks continue to ripple through the economy. The American airline industry losses projected at $4 billion for this year. Continental lays off 12,000 workers. The planes that don't fly and the people afraid to fly mean less travel. Hotel rooms stay empty. Chambermaids, bellhops suffer, may be laid off. Security at the U.S.-Canadian border means auto parts don't get from a Canadian plant to an American plant. And Ford says it may have to close 5 of its plants and cut production by 13%. Now, this all may seem cold-blooded in the wake of the death and devastation of Tuesday, but think about it. If Tuesday's attacks also wind up severely hurting the world's biggest economy, that means that those attacks have produced more suffering. So, how big a hit will the U.S. economy take? Is this short-term or long-term? What policies, what actions might the government, might private citizens, might companies take to minimize this damage? Here to talk with us about that are, from our San Francisco bureau, Laura Tyson. She is former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton. She is now dean of the Haas School of Business at the University of California. Here in New York with me, Michael Weinstein. He is acting director of the Geoeconomics Center at the Council on Foreign Relations, was a writer on economic matters for the New York Times and other publications. And speaking of the New York Times, also joining us here in New York, Floyd Norris. He is the chief financial correspondent for the New York Times. We're going to turn to the market situation, but Laura Tyson, I'd like you to put yourself in the position of your old job after this has happened. Now, once the horror fades, specifically, as you start having to think about the impact on the U.S. economy, what are the questions you're asking yourself?
Well, there are a couple of questions. A major question is the effect on consumer confidence. We know that in some ways this is similar to a natural disaster. There's been serious destruction and dislocation. There will be rebuilding. There's also been a temporary loss of production and consumption this week as businesses all over the country stayed shut down and consumers stayed home and thought seriously about many other issues than just going out to buy something. But the longer-term question is what happens to consumer confidence? Consumers still account for 2/3 of the economy in terms of spending. Consumer confidence going into Tuesday was already at an 8.5-year low. And was headed, we thought, in a downward direction. So the biggest uncertainty and the biggest risk to the economy is consumer confidence. Now, one of the things that is very, I think, different here in terms of the natural catastrophe analogy is that this has brought people together across the country. It's mobilized people, and that may have a rallying effect. It may have a rallying effect on how people consume, on how they treat government spending, on how they treat the equity markets when they reopen. And that's an uncertainty. That's something that we don't have much precedent for.
Indeed. But speaking of that, would you, if you were today the chair of the council, and the president was asking you for guidance, would you be focused more on what happens in the markets tomorrow, or would you be continuing to look at the broader economy, the consumer behavior that you talked about?
We would certainly be looking at the broader economy. I mean, we said all the time during the administration that I was involved with that markets go up and down, and that we have to look at the long-term set of policies in place, and are they the right set of policies. If the economy has taken enough of a hit through a decline in consumer confidence that there is a tipping into recession, if it indeed that we do have a recession, I would be telling the president that I anticipate that recession would be relatively mild and relatively short, and would of course depend upon policy, but I would anticipate that the Federal Reserve will continue to cut interest rates, that the Federal Reserve has been acting to supply the necessary liquidity to the economy, and has in fact been in conversations with banks about lending, easing up on lending to some of the companies that might have some borrowing difficulties because of disruptions. So monetary policy seems to be well in place. There's a lot of collaboration with central banks around the world. The fiscal policy side, this is really where it gets interesting, because if we are going to have a major effort to rebuild or strengthen our security system, strengthen our intelligence infrastructure, and mount some kind of military action, all of that costs money.
Can you, Laura, can I just interrupt you for just a second and bring some others in?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Floyd Norris, I suggested in the introduction some ways that one effect can trigger others. As you look at the broader economic picture right now, what are the factors that should either give us the most concern or reassure us?
Well, the factor obviously that gives most concern is that people are scared. There's a lot of fear right now that this will happen again. In Europe, we saw last week the stock market came down sharply on the news of the terrorism attack, and then stabilized, and then came a lot down more on Friday when Europeans realized how serious this was and how determined our government was to respond with some kind of a military attack. And they're worried this is going to destabilize. As a one-off event, these attacks were serious but not debilitating. This is a huge economy. The effect of this by itself probably would be comparable to a huge earthquake in California. And there'd be even a little good economic news, if you like, out of that. The government, which was running a fairly conservative fiscal policy and talking about Social Security lockboxes and all that went out the window.
What you mean is the government's going to spend a whole lot of money.
The government's going to spend a lot of money. That's going to help stimulate the economy a little bit. On the other hand, people probably are going to pull in their horns, and that's going to have an effect.
And I wanted to ask, forgive me for interrupting, but I may have to, in the course of this conversation, ask for translation from economics to English. But we're doing okay so far. Michael Weinstein, you're a bit of a contrarian in some sense, in that I take it you're a bit skeptical about the notion that we're necessarily in for rough economic sledding.
Well, I think only a fool would make a prediction. We don't have events like this to base a prediction on. There are two facts that are important. One is this economy, as Floyd was saying, is remarkably resilient. And in the past, one-off events, whether it's massive earthquakes in California or the Kennedy assassination or a 20% evaporation of the value of stocks on one day in October of '87, you don't see it in the economy weeks and months later. The economy brushes it off. If this remains a truly one-shot event, the history tells us probably we shrug it off.
But in the Gulf, when the Gulf War, I always thought this was a great irony about the Gulf War, because George Bush, the father, went to 91%, and yet the decline in consumer confidence from the Gulf War was enough to cost us 1 million automobile sales, enough to push us into a recession which, however mild, probably ended his political fate. Now, if the loss of consumer confidence in a situation like the Gulf War, relatively few lives lost, a relatively quick victory, could do that, even if this is not a repeated event, isn't the sheer magnitude of this enough to drive consumer confidence down sharply enough so that even if it does eventually come back, it's going to really cost a whole lot of jobs and earnings.
That's a plausible story. I don't see any particular evidence in history to suggest that that's a compelling story. I don't know if it's going to be true this time. It could be right, could be wrong. I don't think we know. Okay. But let's not forget the other part of Laura's story. We're not passive sheep here. We have a Federal Reserve and a monetary policy. We have Congress prepared to send checks out to people. They've got the right idea for a short-term stimulus. If things turn downward, it's not as if we don't have any levers to pull. So when you have a $11 trillion ocean liner that isn't buffeted very easily, and second, you have rather powerful government levers to pull. Both of them are...
Ms. Tyson, go ahead.
Well, I was going to just agree with Michael and say one other thing, that we are lucky in an important respect here. What was difficult for President Bush Sr. is that he went into that Iraqi invasion with a serious deficit problem and the inability really to run a stimulative fiscal policy. In fact, what he was having to do was to work out deficit reduction packages and tax increases despite his campaign promise, and he was put in a position of having to fund that war, but doing it in a fiscally contractionary way. This time around, we have a large surplus. Now, it is true that it is currently earmarked, the majority of it is currently earmarked for Social Security. But it seems to me it makes imminent sense, given that the economy is weak and given that we have this pressing need to rebuild and strengthen our security infrastructure and to take action to bring justice, that we dip into that surplus. We have the room here to actually stimulate the economy and do the right thing from the point of view of our security and military policy, because we have a surplus, and we should all be very thankful for that. That's one of the benefits for not running a deficit, is you have discretion to use fiscal policy the right way.
Let me, though, because I realize that we're focusing on the economy, but what happened here in some ways overhangs economic questions in a way that I don't know that we've ever had to talk about. Let me give you one example. One of the reasons supposedly why investors abroad have been attracted to the United States, it is the capital not only of world power but of stability. It's a safe place to invest money. If investors abroad decide that they no longer believe that about the United States, doesn't that produce major economic problems?
If investors decided they wanted to get out of the United States, given the huge trade deficit we're running, that would create a problem, no question about it, if they decided that for any reason. We have not seen a lot of evidence they want to do that. And one of the reasons this is so shocking to us is that we have been largely free from terrorism the way many industrialized countries have not. London for years had IRA bombings. They dealt with them. I never lived in London during that period, but the people went on. And the British economy went on. Thankfully, those bombings stopped. We hope they don't resume. But investments here, the question of whether investments here are going to continue, is going to be based on the perception of the soundness of the U.S. economy, the soundness of our companies.
Not whether or not the United States may be a target for repeated acts of terrorism?
I don't think that's going to be the controlling factor. We're still talking, you mentioned the word stability. And we've still got stability here. Nobody's talking that these terrorism attacks are going to result in the government changing in any way.
Fair enough. Michael, there's another thing about, we grope for past analogies. They're probably inadequate. But here's one that I just want to get your guidance on, and then Laura Tyson, Floyd, if you want to join in. One of the things about World War II was that it came after a depression that had lasted a decade. And in one sense, it was an economic boom. I mean, everybody went to work. The unemployment, shrunk. We were building planes and tanks and jets and uniforms, and Rosie the Riveter was in the factories.
Got us out of the depression.
Okay, exactly. Now, so that while people may have been